The alarm pierced through the quiet hum of the starship like a knife cutting through silk. Commander Veltar's 4 eyes snapped open as the emergency beacon flashed red across his console. His scaled fingers danced over the controls, pulling up the incoming transmission. Static filled the bridge speakers, then a voice broke through, desperate, terrified. "This is Mining Colony Tau 7 under attack. They took the children. Please, someone help us." The transmission cut to silence. Dr. Hyun-Woo Kim sat in the ship's research lab, hunched over his datapad, studying alien plant samples. The emergency announcement echoed through the corridors, making him look up from his work. His dark eyes focused on the speaker as the details came through. "All crew to stations. We have received a distress call from Tau 7. 47 colonists have been taken hostage by unknown raiders. Repeat, 47 hostages including multiple juveniles." Hyun-Woo's stylus slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the metal floor. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the suddenly quiet lab. His heart began beating faster, though he couldn't explain why. Something about those words, multiple juveniles, sent ice through his veins. He saved his research and headed toward the bridge, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. The ship felt different now, charged with tension. Crew members rushed past him, their alien faces showing various expressions of concern and determination. On the bridge, chaos ruled. The communication officer, a tall, blue-skinned Altarian, worked frantically at her station. "I'm trying to re-establish contact, sir, but there's too much interference." Commander Veltar turned his massive head toward the tactical display. "What do we know about Tau 7? Mining colony, established 15 years ago, reported the intelligence officer. Population of 237 beings from 12. Different species, they extract rare minerals from the asteroid belt." "And the raiders?" "Unknown, sir. The transmission was too brief to get a clear reading." Hyun-Woo stepped onto the bridge, drawing curious glances from the alien crew. Most had never worked closely with humans before. To them, he was just another soft-skinned biped from a distant world called Earth. "Commander," Hyun-Woo said, his voice steady despite the storm building inside him. "I'd like to assist with the rescue operation." Veltar's mandibles clicked together, the equivalent of a raised eyebrow. "Dr. Kim, I appreciate your concern, but this is a military matter. Civilian safety protocols strictly forbid." "Those children," Hyun-Woo interrupted, then caught himself. He took a breath, forcing his voice to remain calm. "The juveniles who were taken, what species are they?" The intelligence officer consulted his screen. "Mixed group, 2 Centaurian cubs, 1 vegan adolescent, and..." He paused, checking his data. 3 human children, ages 7, 9, and 11 standard years. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Hyun-Woo stood perfectly still, but something had changed in his posture. The casual friendliness was gone, replaced by something harder, more focused. "I see," he said quietly. Commander Veltar noticed the shift, but didn't understand it. In his experience, humans were emotional creatures, prone to outbursts and irrational behavior. This human sudden stillness seemed like shock. "Dr. Kim, I understand this is distressing, but we have trained personnel to handle these situations." "Of course," Hyun-Woo nodded. "What's the plan?" "Standard rescue protocol. We'll arrive at Tau 7, assess the situation, and determine the best course of action. If the hostages have been moved, we'll track them and initiate negotiations." "Negotiations," Hyun-Woo repeated. "Yes. Galactic peacekeeping regulations require us to attempt diplomatic solutions before considering force." "How long do negotiations typically take?" Veltar's tail swished nervously. Something in the human's tone made him uncomfortable. "It varies, anywhere from several hours to several days depending on the demands." Hyun-Woo nodded again, filing away this information. "I'll return to my quarters then. Let me know if you need any assistance with biological matters." He turned and walked off the bridge, leaving the alien crew to their preparations. But instead of going to his quarters, Hyun-Woo made his way to the ship's computer terminal. His fingers moved across the holographic interface with surprising speed and precision. Ship schematics, security protocols, weapon storage locations, shuttle bay access codes, personnel rotation schedules. He memorized it all. Back on the bridge, the Krillian security chief watched the humans' quarters through the internal monitoring system. "Commander, the human has been unusually quiet. He's just sitting there, staring at the wall." Veltar made a note in his log. "Human passenger showing signs of stress response to crisis situation. Recommend psychological evaluation upon completion of current mission." Neither alien officer understood what they were really seeing. Dr. Hyunwoo Kim wasn't in shock. He wasn't overwhelmed by emotion. He was planning, and somewhere deep in his human DNA, ancient instincts were awakening. The Star's Promise dropped out of hyperspace with a shudder that ran through every deck. Through the main view screen, Tau 7 hung like a broken jewel against the black of space. Half the mining station's lights were dark, and debris floated around it like scattered bones. Hyunwoo stood at the back of the bridge, officially there as a scientific observer. His hands were clasped behind his back, but his knuckles were white with tension. The sight of the damaged colony made something twist in his stomach. "Life signs?" Commander Veltar asked. "Detecting 190 survivors in the lower sections," reported the sensor operator. "They've sealed themselves into the emergency shelters." Lieutenant Jimin Park, the ship's communications officer, worked at her station with barely controlled urgency. Her human hands moved faster than her alien crewmates could follow. "I'm getting a signal from the colony administrator." The main screen flickered to life, showing an elderly Centaurian with singed fur and haunted eyes. "Thank the stars you're here. They came out of nowhere, military-grade ships, professional raiders. They hit us hard and fast." "How many were taken?" Veltar asked. 47 souls. They grabbed families mostly. Said they needed leverage." The administrator's voice cracked. "The children. They specifically targeted the children." Jimin's face went pale. She glanced back at Hyunwoo, whose expression had turned to stone. "Do we know who's responsible?" the commander continued. "Vorthak raiders. Their leader called himself Crexmore. Said if we tried to follow, they'd start executing hostages one by one, youngest first." The bridge fell silent except for the hum of life support systems. Hyunwoo's breathing had become very slow, very controlled. "Where did they take the hostages?" Veltar asked. "Tau 7b, the moon. There's an old fortress there from the mining wars, heavily defended, built into the rock itself. On the tactical display, Tau 7b appeared. A storm-racked world of stone and lightning. The fortress showed up as a dark blot against the mountainside, its energy signatures indicating serious defensive capabilities. "Commander," the intelligence officer spoke up, "the Vorthak are known traffickers. They specialize in selling sentient beings to illegal research facilities and other markets." Jimin made a small, strangled sound. Hyunwoo didn't move, but his eyes never left the image of the moon fortress. "Time is critical," the administrator continued. "They said they'd leave the system in 72 hours whether we paid or not. But sir, we're just miners. We don't have the kind of wealth they're demanding." Commander Veltar's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. "We'll handle this according to galactic peacekeeping protocols. First, we establish communication with the raiders and assess their demands." "Communication?" Hyunwoo spoke for the first time, his voice carefully neutral. "Standard procedure, Dr. Kim. We open negotiations, look for diplomatic solutions. It's how civilized beings handle these situations. And if they refuse to negotiate? Then we call for reinforcements and prepare for a siege scenario. The fortress is too well defended for a direct assault." Hyunwoo nodded slowly. "How long do sieges typically last?" The tactical officer consulted his database. "Historical average is 18 days. Could be longer if they're well supplied." 18 days, Hyunwoo repeated quietly. Jimin turned in her chair. "Sir, I've managed to establish contact with the fortress. The raiders are responding." The screen switched to show a massive Vorthak warrior, his scarred face twisted in a cruel grin. "Peacekeepers," he sneered. "Right on time. I am Crexmore, and I have something you want." "We're prepared to discuss terms," Veltar said diplomatically. Crexmore laughed, a sound like grinding metal. Terms, I'll give you terms, 10 million credits, in untraceable currency, or I start sending you pieces of hostages, starting with the smallest ones. In the background of the transmission, they could hear crying, the sound of terrified children calling for their parents. Jimin's hands clenched into fists. Hyunwoo's face remained perfectly calm, but something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. We'll need time to arrange payment, Veltar said. You have 48 hours. After that, I start my demonstration. The human cubs will go first. Their screams make the best recordings for motivation. The transmission cut off, leaving the bridge in stunned silence. Monsters, Jimin whispered. We'll get them back, Veltar assured her. We just need to be smart about this, no unnecessary risks. Hyunwoo excused himself quietly, walking off the bridge with measured steps, but the security cameras tracked him as he moved through the ship, not to his quarters, but to the computer terminals in the research section. His fingers danced across the holographic displays, pulling up files on Vorthak physiology, moon fortress construction, atmospheric conditions on Tau 7b, and weapons specifications. He studied combat manuals, memorized guard rotation patterns, and calculated orbital mechanics. Meanwhile, on the bridge, the alien crew began their careful, methodical planning. They discussed negotiation strategies, backup plans, and political ramifications. They weighed casualty projections and resource allocation, but none of them understood that while they planned like civilized beings, Hyunwoo was planning like something else entirely. Something that had once hunted mammoths across frozen plains and defended caves full of helpless young against creatures with teeth like knives. The children had been in enemy hands for 26 hours now. In his bones, Hyunwoo could feel every passing minute like a physical pain. And somewhere deep inside, ancient instincts whispered that talk was cheap, but action saved lives. The old warehouse felt different that night. The air seemed thicker, almost electric with tension. Detective Riley had been tracking this case for months, following a trail of missing persons that all led back to this abandoned building on the outskirts of town. What started as routine investigations had slowly revealed something much darker. Inside the warehouse, a group of people sat around a makeshift table. They weren't your typical criminals. Most looked like ordinary citizens, a teacher, a mechanic, a retired nurse, a college student. But desperation had brought them together, and desperation was about to make them cross a line they never thought they would. The leader of the group, a middle-aged man named Tom, spread out photos on the table. Each photo showed a different person, all wealthy, all powerful, all seemingly untouchable by the law. These were people who had hurt others and walked away without consequences. Politicians who had stolen money meant for schools. Business owners who had poisoned water supplies. Judges who had taken bribes and sent innocent people to prison. The system has failed us, Tom said quietly, his voice steady but filled with years of frustration. We've tried the legal way. We've filed complaints, attended hearings, voted in elections. Nothing changes. These people continue to hurt innocent families while living in their mansions. The retired nurse, Helen, nodded slowly. Her own grandson had been poisoned by contaminated water from one of the factories shown in the photos. The doctor said he would never fully recover. The factory owner had paid a small fine and continued operating. But what we're talking about doing, said Jake, the college student, this isn't justice. This is revenge. Tom looked around the table at each face. Is it revenge when you stop a rabid dog from biting more children? These people are like a disease. They spread corruption wherever they go. Sometimes when medicine doesn't work, you need surgery. The teacher, Linda, had been quiet until now. Her school had lost funding because a city official had diverted the money to his own projects. 30 teachers had been fired, and hundreds of children were now in overcrowded classrooms with outdated books. My students deserved better, she whispered. All those kids who won't get the education they need because one man wanted a bigger bank account. Outside, Detective Riley crept closer to the building. Through a broken window, she could see the group inside. She recognized some of them from her investigations, good people who had been pushed too far. She knew what they were planning, and she knew she should call for backup. But something made her pause and listen. The mechanic, Carlos, pulled out a detailed map of the city. Red X marks showed the locations where each target lived and worked. "We've been watching them for weeks," he explained. "We know their routines, their security systems, their weak points. We can make this look like accidents. No one will suspect anything." Helen shook her head. "I keep thinking about my grandson. When I look at his face, I see what these monsters have taken from him. But I also think about my daughter. What would she say if she knew what I was planning? Would she still be proud to call me her mother?" The room fell silent. Each person was wrestling with the same internal battle. They had all reached their breaking point, but crossing this line would change them forever. There would be no going back. Tom stood up and walked to the window. "I lost my brother because of these people," he said, his back to the group. He was a whistleblower who tried to expose corruption in the police department. They made his life hell until he couldn't take it anymore. He took his own life rather than continue fighting a system designed to protect the guilty. "Detective," Riley felt her chest tighten. She remembered that case. A good cop who had tried to do the right thing and paid the ultimate price for it. The investigation had been quietly buried, and the corrupt officers had kept their jobs. "But here's what I realized," Tom continued, turning back to face the group. "My brother died believing in justice. He never gave up hope that the system could be fixed. If we do this, we're saying he was wrong. We're saying justice is dead." Jake leaned forward. "So what are you saying? We just give up? Let these people continue destroying lives?" "No," Tom replied. "I'm saying we find another way, a better way. We expose them so thoroughly that they can't hide anymore. We make their crimes so public that the system has no choice but to act." The group looked uncertain. After months of planning, the idea of stepping back from the edge felt almost impossible. They had convinced themselves that violence was the only solution left. Helen finally spoke. "Maybe we're not thinking big enough. Instead of becoming killers, maybe we become something more powerful. Maybe we become the voice for everyone who has been silenced." The line was there, waiting to be crossed. But sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is step away from the darkness and choose to fight in the light instead. The decision had been made. Instead of crossing that dark line, the group chose a different path. But what they didn't realize was that their choice would lead them into something far more dangerous than they ever imagined. 3 weeks after that night in the warehouse, strange things started happening around the city. People began disappearing, but not the corrupt officials they had been targeting. Instead, ordinary citizens were vanishing without a trace. A grocery store clerk here, a bus driver there, a librarian who worked the night shift. Detective Riley noticed the pattern first. All the missing people had one thing in common. They had recently filed complaints against powerful individuals or companies. They were whistleblowers, witnesses, or simply people who had spoken up about wrongdoing they had witnessed. Tom and his group realized they weren't the only ones who had identified the corrupt network in their city. But unlike them, whoever was behind these disappearances had no moral boundaries. They weren't just planning to cross the line. They had already sprinted past it and kept running. The group met again, this time in Helen's basement. The retired nurse had converted the space into a makeshift command center, with computers, documents, and maps covering every available surface. What had started as a revenge plot had transformed into something much more complex. "We've been thinking, too small," Linda said, pointing to a wall covered with photos and connecting strings like something from a detective movie. "These people aren't just individual criminals. They're part of something bigger, a network that protects itself by eliminating threats." Carlos had been doing research on his laptop. "I've been digging into the backgrounds of everyone who's disappeared. Look at this." He turned his screen toward the group. Every single one of them had evidence that could have brought down major players in our city. But now they're gone, and their evidence has vanished with them. Jake was pacing nervously around the room. "So what you're saying is that while we were debating whether to become killers, actual killers were already cleaning house?" Tom nodded grimly. "And they're good at it. Professional. These aren't crimes of passion or revenge. This is systematic elimination of threats. Helen pulled out a thick folder. I've been a nurse for 40 years. I know what death looks like, and I know what murder looks like. 3 of the missing people were patients at my hospital before they disappeared. They all came in with similar symptoms: confusion, memory loss, difficulty speaking. Classic signs of poisoning. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They weren't dealing with corrupt politicians or greedy business owners anymore. They were facing something much more sinister, a group that had turned elimination into a science. Detective Riley had been conducting her own investigation. She had evidence that linked several city officials to the disappearances, but every time she got close to making an arrest, her leads would mysteriously dry up. Files would go missing from evidence rooms. Witnesses would suddenly refuse to talk. Her own partner had been transferred to another department without explanation. That's when she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of working within the system that was clearly compromised, she decided to reach out to the one group she knew was also investigating the same network, Tom's group. The meeting happened at midnight in an abandoned parking garage. Riley approached cautiously, her hand near her weapon but not threatening. Tom and Carlos had come alone, leaving the others in a safe location. I know what you're planning, Riley said without introduction. And I know you decided not to go through with it. But I need you to understand something. Your restraint might have saved your souls, but it didn't save anyone else. She handed Tom a manila envelope filled with photos and documents. 17 people have disappeared in the last month. All of them were preparing to expose corruption. All of them are probably dead. Carlos looked through the photos, his face growing pale. I recognized some of these people. They were going to be our witnesses. People who could have testified about what they'd seen. The people you were originally targeting, Riley continued, they're not just corrupt. They're part of an organization that has been operating in this city for years. They have people in the police department, the mayor's office, the court system. When someone threatens to expose them, that person disappears. Tom studied one particular photo, a young man who looked barely out of college. Who was he? A journalist, Riley replied. He was investigating illegal dumping by one of the companies on your list. He was supposed to publish his story last week. Instead, his apartment was found empty, with no signs of struggle. All his research was gone. The 3 of them stood, in silence, processing the magnitude of what they were facing. This wasn't about individual acts of corruption anymore. This was about survival, both for potential victims and for anyone trying to expose the truth. So what do we do? Carlos asked. If the system is completely compromised, if they're willing to kill to protect themselves, how do we fight something like that? Riley looked at both men. We do what survivors do. We adapt. We become smarter, more careful, and more determined than they are. We stop playing by rules that they've already broken. Tom understood. We become what we need to become to protect innocent people. Exactly, Riley said. We become what this situation requires. We become Deathworlders. The term Deathworld wasn't something any of them had heard before, but Detective Riley explained it in a way that made everything click into place. She had learned about it during a federal training course years ago. A concept originally used to describe planets in science fiction that were so dangerous that only the toughest species could survive there. Think about it this way, Riley said as they sat in Helen's basement the next evening. Our city has become a death world, not because of alien monsters or poisonous air, but because speaking the truth has become deadly. Normal people, good people, are disappearing just for trying to do the right thing. Helen nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. So the people who survive in this environment have to be different. They have to be tougher, smarter, more adaptable than regular folks. Exactly, Riley continued. In nature, when an environment becomes hostile, creatures either adapt or die out. The ones that survive develop new skills, new instincts, new ways of thinking. That's what we need to become. Jake was taking notes on his laptop. something he did when he was nervous. But we're not talking about growing claws or developing thick skin. What does it mean for humans to become Deathworlders? Tom had been quiet, but now he spoke up. It means we stop thinking like civilians and start thinking like survivors. We assume everyone might be compromised. We assume we're being watched. We assume that one mistake could get us killed. Linda shuddered at the thought. That sounds like living in constant fear. How is that better than what we have now? Carlos, who had been studying the maps and photos spread across the table, looked up. Because fear keeps you alive. My grandfather lived through a war when he was young. He used to tell me stories about how people had to change to survive. They learned to notice things others missed. They developed instincts that warned them of danger. They became harder to fool and impossible to surprise. Riley pulled out her phone and showed them a news article. Look at this. Another missing person report filed yesterday. An accountant who was preparing to testify about financial irregularities in city contracts. His family says he was excited about finally exposing the truth. Now he's gone. The room fell silent as they processed this information. Each disappearance represented not just a life lost, but also evidence destroyed and justice denied. Helen stood up and walked to a wall covered with photos of all the missing people. These people weren't Deathworlders. They trusted the system. They believed that doing the right thing would protect them. They thought that being good citizens was enough. And they're probably dead because of it, Tom said bluntly. Not because they were bad people, but because they didn't understand the world they were living in. Jake looked uncomfortable. So what you're saying is that we have to become paranoid and suspicious of everyone? That doesn't sound like living. That sounds like existing in a nightmare. Detective Riley understood his concern. It's not about becoming paranoid. It's about becoming aware. A Deathworlder doesn't jump at shadows, but they do notice when shadows are in the wrong place. She began explaining the practical aspects of their new reality. In a death world, communication had to be secure. They couldn't use regular phones or email because those could be monitored. They had to assume that any technology could be compromised. Meeting places had to be varied and unpredictable. The same location twice in a row was a pattern, and patterns could be detected and exploited. They needed to think like their enemies, always planning 3 steps ahead. Most importantly, they had to understand that in a death world, allies were precious, and enemies often looked like friends. The corruption they were fighting had survived by placing people in positions of trust. Police officers, judges, city officials, any of them could be working for the other side. Carlos shared a story that made this point clear. My cousin worked construction for the city. He noticed that some projects were using cheap materials but billing for expensive ones. He reported it to his supervisor, thinking he was being a good employee. 2 days later, he was fired for performance issues. A week after that, someone broke into his apartment and destroyed all his paperwork. Your cousin was lucky, Riley said. If this had happened recently, he might have just disappeared. Linda was beginning to understand the scope of their situation. So we're not just dealing with a few corrupt individuals. We're dealing with an entire ecosystem that has evolved to protect itself, like antibodies attacking anything that threatens the system. Tom nodded. And just like antibodies, this system has learned to identify threats early and neutralize them quickly. The people who are disappearing aren't random victims. They are specifically chosen because they pose a danger to the network. Helen returned to her seat, looking older than she had at the beginning of the evening. My grandson is 8 years old. By the time he grows up, what kind of world will this be? Will speaking the truth always be a death sentence? Not if we can help it, Riley said firmly. That's why we're here. That's why we're learning to be Deathworlders. Not because we want to live in fear, but because we want to survive long enough to change things. Jake closed his laptop and looked around the room. So where do we start? How do we begin this transformation? Tom smiled grimly. We start by assuming that everything we thought we knew about staying safe was wrong. Then we learn new rules. Rules that will keep us alive in a world where the truth is deadly.